All right, everyone. Today we're talking with friend of the show, Ian Nelson. I wanted to bring him on today. Some of you may have seen some videos he's been in the past, but he's got a really unique perspective right now, going from a medium-sized company where we actually used to work together, then going to a market leader, and now working at a really small company, having to bring it to market for the first time. So I think it's just going to shed light on some great perspectives of the pros and cons of both, and some things that you do and don't have in both approaches. But before I get too far ahead of myself, Ian, thanks again for your time, and maybe walk us through kind of your journey in tech sales and getting to the point where you are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be back on the show as well. So I think it all started me being a BDR. We worked at, a medium-sized tech company together. And I think it was a really great start to my career. It was large enough to where we had some kind of presence. We weren't necessarily learning sales from scratch, but it wasn't so large that, you know, your brand name kind of carried you and you didn't do a whole lot of your own. So it was great to learn from that company, worked there for about a year. Like you mentioned, then I transitioned to a market leader. Going to that, I think was very eye-opening, for a lot of different things. I think, in terms of taking my sales game to the next level and honing in the sales strategy, super, super helpful there. And then there's some other things to be desired. I think we can get into a little bit later in this. And then, worked there for about a year as well. And I since transitioned to a small startup called Scribble Data. And I'm basically building out, the sales function there. And that's been very, very interesting and looking forward to getting into that. So
Nice. Yeah, and I think we'll kind of take some of those pieces apart a little bit more, but definitely maybe focusing on that most recent move to Scribble, right? Like what ultimately made you decide to take a chance on a smaller company, and how's it been thus far?
yeah, absolutely. I started working at the large company that I mentioned. It was great in the beginning, learning a lot, constantly iterating, mastering the sales process. And then I kind of hit this point where, as working in a large company as well, the upward mobility is pretty capped, right? And the room for creativity is also pretty capped. You're largely not really going to invent something new at a large company, right? Everything's kind of been figured out. The playbook's been distilled. It's been handed down to you, and your job is just to be a really, really good executor of that playbook, right? And I learned. I was like, okay, I'm pretty good at executing this playbook. Like I know that that's not all I want to do with the rest of my life, right? I don't want to just, execute a playbook that's been handed to me, make small little iterations here and there. I really wanted to take a chance and, take all those principles that I learned from, not only that job, but the previous job and say, hey, what if I could be the one to create that playbook, for myself to execute on, for other people to execute on, kind of just honestly from square one. And the prospect of that really excited me quite a bit. And that's why I ultimately made the choice to join Scribble when I did. So
Yeah. And I think, kind of getting a little bit deeper too, it's like thinking about the pros and cons of both for someone that's maybe thinking startup versus large company, maybe in a large company, thinking about finally trying that startup, right? Like maybe a little bit tactically, and it's an open-ended question, but when you're calling from a market leader versus calling from this small company, or are you even calling, right? Like, what are the differences you're seeing in your approach where maybe previously at a large company, you've got that brand recognition? At a small company, how has it been different? And feel free to take that question where you want.
yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I think like not to go too far down this topic, it's kind of like hot topic in sales. I don't know how functional calling really is anymore in sales, but moving on kind of from that topic, but I just looking at the email thing, right? You send an email, and I won't use my previous company, like you send an email and it's like at Microsoft.com or at Google.com or at Amazon.com. And it almost, kind of boosts your status in the sales interaction pretty instantly. So maybe your messaging, you can be a little less refined. Your call to action doesn't have to be as good. I think you can honestly just kind of get away with a lot more, and not necessarily have to add, as much value or anything like that working at one of those market leaders because, the brand name carries a lot for you. And then you transition to a startup. And I like to say it's like almost sales kind of on like just level 9,000. Like it's still either one of sales, right? Sales at AWS, sales at Microsoft, sales at Google. It's the same as sales at Scribble, but you just have to be so much more airtight with your messaging, right? Because there's nothing for you to fall back on except what you're presenting to the person across from the table. And they're already pretty immediately skeptical. So it is interesting in that sense, to be much more refined, much more airtight. I think that, makes it more fun knowing you can't necessarily get away with, oh, I didn't really have a great sales call today, but things will still progress nicely. You really have to be on point at all times is the biggest takeaway that I've honestly had so far, going from, market leader to, much smaller company.
Yeah. And maybe more on a tactical level, right? When you're saying that you have to really be on point, are there things or examples that come to mind where maybe you were lazier when you had that brand recognition that now when you're presenting, obviously you give the example of being tight, really knowing your stuff, right? But is there any real example that comes to mind, maybe without providing names or specifics?
Yeah, great question. I'll try not to provide names or specifics. But at the previous company I worked at, we'd be running demos all the time, and it's almost like you could probably run, one of the worst demos ever. Not as an AE, because as an AE you're not necessarily running them, but as the SE could probably run, one of the worst, least relevant demos ever. But the prospect already knows so much about the company that it's kind of just like, they're just kind of sitting through the demo to appease you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it still go further down the sales cycle. That part, that I think that part to me is where it's like the most clear. It didn't have to be airtight. Because I think, with my messaging and with the way I run calls, I think we all like to think this, but I like to think that I, ran like pretty tight ship in doing that. But yeah, going on to Scribble and like the way we have to give demos, right? If it's not really relevant to the customer, since they don't know who we are, they're not going to immediately see, oh, okay, Scribble would help us solve these problems, because they don't know who we are, or we can't fall back on, an AWS, a Microsoft, a Google type of brand where people know who we are, what problems we solve, and otherwise, right? So like they don't know who we are. So if we give a demo that doesn't really speak towards what they're trying to solve, they're not necessarily going to try and fill in those gaps themselves, because they already kind of feel like they're doing us a favor by being on the call with us, right? And so like that's why it's just that much more important to, okay, your specific use case is this, you're looking to solve this problem. I'm going to perfectly tailor the demo now, because there's nothing else for you to fall back on, in that case. So
Sure. Yeah, and I'm curious on that note too, right? One of the things that we kind of touched on, but getting back into as well, is certainly a difference in resources, whether it's human capital or just online documentation. So many things come to mind, right? Now that you're kind of in this small startup environment, where are you getting coaching, if any, and or just advice from, right? Where previously I'm sure you had colleagues maybe that had been at the company for 2 or 3 years or way more than that. Now you're kind of coming in pretty fresh, maybe one or two colleagues that can help you out, but nowhere near that, right? How do you stay fresh? How are you being challenged? How are you constantly iterating on your approach?
yeah, I mean, it's a great question. First of all, I think that is where I would actually, going back to, because I think we kind of alluded towards this, but when would you recommend working for a startup for some people? When would they be ready for the jump? When would they not? I think this is why, early career, you absolutely, when I early career, I mean, as a first job, you absolutely cannot work at a startup of that size and sales, is because, we're still learning how to sell it, right? There's not, like I mentioned before, there's not like, hey, Ian, this is how we sold to all of our customers. This is what works. Here's this playbook, copy this and just execute really well. It's much more, hey, we have some customers, we're looking to get more. Here's some of the common themes we noticed, right? And like, we're almost as a group effort, kind of selling on calls. It's not necessarily me running calls, it's like the CEO will be on the calls, the COO will be on the calls, like the lead data architect will be on the calls. And we're all kind of as a joint effort, doing things and figuring out what works. Like, let's document that, let's record that, let's try that for the next call. That worked super well. Where, at the previous market leading company I had, first of all, there's an entire sales enablement team, right? There's probably 300 or 400 people just crunching chorus calls, figuring out what works, constantly updating the sales playbook. They have like fully standardized sales process, and you're taught it from day one. Not even, there's the sales boot camp, the live instructors, right? There's, the PDS for you to download. And so it's really just like, hey, here's everything you'll ever need, right? And basically just copy this, put it in your flavor, and then try and find little edges here and there that work super well. And so, to kind of answer your question, kind of summarize what I got to is, the larger company, there's enablement teams, there's there's like marketing resources, there's all sorts of like sales managers, weekly coaching sessions, all sorts of stuff like that, just to make sure everything is airtight. And I honestly think it could be too much as well. And moving from that to a startup, it's much more, I wouldn't say you're on your own because you're never truly on your own, but it's you and maybe a couple of other people. Maybe the documentation of what you're doing, isn't as well, defined as it is at a large company, but it's you and a couple people, honestly, still in the experimentation phase. So yeah,
Sure.
that's a lot of
Yeah.
differences there.
No, and I definitely agree with you. I just want to get some clarity too for anyone who might be watching, because I agree with you. If you're going to a company maybe with a brand new product and or a brand new company, incredibly difficult if you have no experience to really find success there. Help better define that, because I don't want to say all startups are bad, right? Because there are startups with 500 to 1,000 to 1,500 people that are moving, right? So put some numbers and context around that too.
Yeah, great point. And I wouldn't want to do it either because I think the first company I worked at out of college and that we worked at together would technically be defined as a startup, but there were about 300 or 400 employees, and it at no point felt like you're fully on your own and you don't have coaching.
Mhm.
I would honestly say first job out of college going into sales, absolutely do not be the first sales hire. That's just going to be far too big of a obstacle for you to climb. I would say ideally, first job out of college, you're likely going to have to be a BDR. Anyways, look for a company that's at least has maybe two or three other BDRs. Right? You don't want to be BDR number one. You probably don't want to be BDR number two either. But if you're BDR number 4 or 5, that's probably enough for you to honestly learn, do well, have some measurable amount of success and continue to develop. So I would say not necessarily based on company size, but look at the size of the sales team. You ideally want to be like fourth or fifth BDR, somewhere around there. Obviously the more coaching you're going to get, maybe the job is easier as well. But yeah, certainly straight out of college, absolutely don't be the first sales hire. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's a great point, and I think a good clarification. And yeah, absolutely. Like if there's multiple BDRs, it's 200, 300 people. They've got some good logos. Those are pretty good baseline criteria to check. And one thing I actually want to double tap into as well, because I spent prior to my current opportunity, I was at a company that brought a new product to market. I largely agree. I don't think calling is totally dead, but the idea that you're going to make 100 dials and set, X amount of meetings a week, like I had very little success with that. And I had to be very, very incredibly targeted with my calls to get any type of result. So I definitely don't want to make the blind statement that cold calling is dead, but certainly at a small company like where you're at, right? I do tend to agree. It's when you consider it and the output you get compared to maybe emailing, LinkedIn, et cetera, right? It may be different. And that's kind of the context of this question, right? Which is going to this small startup. What methods are you seeing are effective? Have you even made any calls? I'm just curious kind of what you've been able to find there in terms of setting meetings, getting opportunities, et cetera.
Yeah, actually, so great point. Similar to what you're saying on the call front, and honestly, kind of watching you and watching other people in the sales space, and even seeing it myself at a market, even I say even at a market leader, um, calling is still a very, very low percentage game. Even when I worked at the market leading company I think I made probably 1,000 calls and set up 2 meetings.
Yep.
And it's like, especially you moving to a small startup, every minute of your time counts. So you really have to look for those, high conversion type of activities. Because like, it's not going to be useful for me to sit and spend, you know, a couple hours a day sitting and calling people when I know what the numbers were at a market leader, right? And then similar situation to you, a company bringing a new product to market. It's really just not a good use of your time. That's kind of been my philosophy as far as calling goes. And honestly, as far as what's worked, you've had to get pretty creative, right? So I'll send, my targeted emails, each week from my account. I'll go and research prospects that are in the space that we're looking to get into, in the space where customers that we've already helped are at. And I'll send emails from my account. And we've, that's not necessarily been super, super successful because again, I think pure cold, especially at that small of a startup, is pretty difficult. But where we've had some level of actual measurable success is, doing LinkedIn campaigns, but not a LinkedIn campaign, coming from me where you can go onto my profile and see like, oh, this person very clearly works in sales, but running a LinkedIn campaign through the co-founders' LinkedIn pages, right? So creating a campaign, going out and sending messages from them saying, hey, look, I've identified you as a leader in this space, right? We've actually built a tool, to help people out in this space. Would love for you to check it out and maybe give some feedback or otherwise, right? And that typically is kind of a two-pronged thing, right? That is, legitimate ask, because at this stage, you're certainly, I think you never are, but especially at this stage, you're definitely not above, product feedback. But also it can turn into sales conversations too, right? We're asking for feedback or otherwise from maybe a director of analytics, and they see it and they're like, oh, wait, this actually solves something that my team, is looking to fix or looking to do. I'd love to get a little bit further, down the line with you guys. What do financials look like? What does, all of this look like as far as moving forward? That's been honestly the best approach to date in terms of, constantly getting meetings and having these conversations. But the biggest theme I think in a startup, especially that I'm finding, is you just have to get experimental, right? The typical, hey, cold call, just cold email, maybe on a long enough time horizon works, but especially in a startup, you're kind of time constrained, right? You don't have, the luxury of being at a large company that has, billions of dollars of cash on hand to constantly sustain, the sales team. You kind of have to move quick and you need to get new logos fast. And that's been our best approach to date. And then we're constantly experimenting, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think also clarifying too, I'm sure there's some people that would disagree on the cold calling front. I think, it's worth putting up parameters. They've done studies. There's been data around, in particular, very technical personas have such a lower engagement rate on the phone as well. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. Like, we are selling to some of the most technical engineers in the world. And yeah, I think 2% of people pick up. And that doesn't mean they take a conversation, right? So just re-emphasizing there, I think that context is important when compared to maybe someone selling sales tools or otherwise, where people are more likely to take calls. So
I was gonna say, couldn't agree more. And I think that's actually, a broader topic. We don't have to go down it. But I think one of the more interesting things about our space is some of the biggest, thought leaders in sales sell, sales tech, or they sell marketing tech. And sales is always sales, but it's not necessarily applicable across verticals, right? Something that me or you do that works super well in really technical SaaS is probably not going to apply when you're selling Chorus or Gong, right?
yeah,
And similarly, something that works super, super well, maybe, selling on 24 or any other kind of MarTech, platform, because of the persona you're selling to, isn't necessarily going to work well selling, super highly technical SaaS. So it, I think most sales advice, especially in our space, kind of has to be taken within context, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I think going to another point too, it's like, take it, make it your own, and experiment with it, right? And quickly qualify out if it's not working. But yeah, I think this was great context, and maybe kind of in summary, question or two, up to you and open ended. If I'm someone who's maybe, I know we talked about the case starting your career. I totally agree. Don't go to a startup where you're like the first BDR, or they're bringing a new product to market and you're solely responsible for that. That's a really tough position with no experience to be in. But let's take the case, maybe I'm 2 to 3 years in my career. I've worked at a mid or a large company. I'm thinking about a startup. And let's start with that case, and then we'll look at the reverse as well. At what point do you evaluate a startup? How do you know if it's a good fit? How would you even break that decision down personally?
Yeah. So there were a couple of different things for myself, right? So there's two pronged. You need to evaluate yourself, and then you need to evaluate the startup that you're going to, right? I think on the evaluate yourself front, you truly need to know, okay, am I legitimately good at sales, right? And it's, you shouldn't answer that in a cocky way or feel a cocky way about yourself, but it's like, am every sales team I join, am I constantly at the top? Right? You absolutely cannot be a middle of the pack performer, or bottom tier performer and go to a startup, because it's sales on, you know difficulty impossible almost sometimes, right? So you need to evaluate yourself. Sales, what that looks like is, am I constantly towards the top? Obviously, a lot of luck is involved with sales as well. It's like, can I break down why what I do in sales works, and can I articulate it to other people, right? If you can answer, yes, I'm good at sales, yes, I'm constantly towards the top, yes, I know why what I'm doing works, yes, I would know how to apply it to, XYZ startup that I'm, going to, then I think you yourself are probably ready. Right now, in terms of the flip side of that coin, okay, great. You determine you're ready to go to a startup. You've kind of got the skills in the bag. And I think there's so much more to evaluate yourself on, but there's the big ones. Now, it turns into, okay, about the startup I'm going to, are they a good one? I think especially in today's day and age, may seem like rude questions. How much cash is on hand, right? What's the zero cash date, right? How many customers do you currently have? What geography are they located in? What are you currently doing that sells well? And then you yourself also need to look at the product, right? I think there's still a lot of leftover startups that were kind of a zero interest rate phenomenon that I think the clock is ticking on. And you truly need to evaluate, okay, is this going to exist, right? Have they had cuts? Are they going to have cuts? Some of these things you can't necessarily ask, but you truly need to do deep research and due diligence when picking a startup, because you pick the wrong one, you might be looking for another job in a couple months, right? And
Sure.
and no one wants to have to do that, especially after just how difficult it is to work at one, and then damn, the script has slipped on you and you have to go look again. So I would say be very, very thorough in not only evaluating yourself but the company that you're going to be going to.
Yeah. And by extension too, do you put as much thought, time, and effort into evaluating a large corporation? When you made that decision in the past, do you think that there's value in getting that badge on the resume? Maybe talk through that process just a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think twofold, right? I think I would recommend everyone at some point in their career work for both small, medium, and large. Because I think you're not going to know which kind of person you enjoy being until you do that. Right. I think, working in a small company, you're very much on your own. You have to be incredibly creative. You have to be very, very self-motivated. And there's not a ton of guardrails. And, it's something you either really like or it's terrifying. And similar situation, working at a large company, there's not as much freedom for creativity, right? There's a lot of guardrails. You don't necessarily have to be self-motivated. There's constantly like check-ins, progress updates, that sort of QBR, all sorts of stuff like that. And like, maybe you really, really like that structure and that's what you want out of a career, right? And so I would say truly figure out who you are as a person, and you might not actually know until you try all three. Yeah, I would say just honestly, just throw yourself at all three, see which one you like the most. And then in terms of, remember you did ask that, how would I evaluate a larger company? I think it's far, far less rigorous, right? Typically, there's thousands of Glassdoor reviews. You can kind of see the common themes. You can message an AE who currently works there, ask for their honest opinion. I think another thing that's useful is LinkedIn actually has a feature where you can see people who have left in the last 6 months. I would reach out to AEs or BDRs who have actually left. People who are there might not be fully honest. They might, out of fear for their current job, not necessarily disseminate as much information. Whereas if you ask a good mix of people who left and a good mix of people who are there, I think you'll get truly a full opinion of what it's like to work at said large company. But otherwise, I mean, I definitely wouldn't apply as much rigor to my evaluation process of a large company as I would to a startup. But
Nice. No, this is great perspective, Ian. And I guess I'll give you the floor for any closing comments, and or feel free to plug Scribble in more depth as well if you'd like.
yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for having me on the channel again. Yeah, no, if anyone's watching this, maybe not necessarily salespeople, more technical. I think Scribble is a great company. I've really enjoyed working there. It's essentially a data products platform, feature engineering core, lightweight ML models applied on top of that, and then a consumption layer for the business team to use. So 2 users, analytics users and business users. Pretty simple, intuitive product for them. Yeah, if anyone's interested, absolutely reach out. And yeah, really, really appreciate the time again, Aaron.
Yeah, of course. And I'll actually put a link to Scribble in the description below for anyone who's interested. But Ian, always appreciate the perspective. And yeah, I think a lot of people who are looking into sales, looking into more technical sales as well, hopefully got a lot out of this. But appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.